Welcome, everyone. Good morning. We are very excited to have you come join us for another of this AE's talk. Before I go ahead and introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Andre Erler, I would like to just briefly introduce ACE to folks who are not familiar with the group. So ACE is a community of machine learning practitioners and researchers who have gathered around topics in AI research, engineering, and products. We host free live sessions like this 3 to 5 times a week and produce premium content in various subject areas. To see more, visit our website at AI.SCIENCE and log in to access slides from this as well as other sessions in the past. Also, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, ML Papers Explained, to get notified about all the live sessions and other free content we publish. We currently have about 14 different streams that are focused on various ML topics, and this session is in the Machine Learning for Climate Science stream. Hope you enjoy it and come back for a future session. Our speaker for today is Dr. Andre Erler. Dr. Erler is a senior climate scientist at Aquanti Incorporated. His main expertise lies in regional climate modeling and applications to hydrology and hydroclimatic extremes. Originally from Germany, he received the equivalent of a master's degree in meteorology from the University of Mainz in 2008 and a PhD in physics from the University of Toronto in 2015. His other interests include open source software development, sustainable development, and food security. For his dissertation, he performed high-resolution climate simulations for Western Canada and studied hydrological impacts of climate change in the Athabasca and Fraser River basins, as well as changes in precipitation extremes due to climate change. Andre joined Aquanti in 2016 in order to study the impact of climate change on water resources and agriculture in Canada and provide insights into climate change impacts to end users. We are very excited to have Dr. Erler with us. Dr. Erler, please take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Peetak. So the doctor is not really necessary, but so my presentation today will be primarily about environmental prediction and the role of machine learning in it. I'll actually talk more about the environmental background than about the machine learning methods because I think you already know more about the technical aspects of machine learning than probably I do. So the purpose of this talk is to give an overview of how machine learning can be used in environmental prediction. And I hope to get some of you folks who have more of a machine learning background interested in this broad topic of environmental prediction. And so give some pointers and hints on how to start going about that if you're interested in doing this. So first of all, like a little bit about me. Peetak already said that I work for a company called Aquanti. We do environmental consulting, and we are also developing prediction systems. Now, this is the picture you've seen of me on YouTube, on LinkedIn, and that Amir grabbed. Actually, I have a beard now, and I do a little bit more climbing. So this is how I look more now. My interest in machine learning actually started a long time ago, already in 2005. I've done a few course projects as a student. I've kind of sneaked it into my thesis a little bit, although mostly that was statistics and high performance computing. I'm also involved with the climate informatics workshop. I'm on the program committee now, and I've supervised some students who have done machine learning projects. So I'm peripherally interested, but it's not my main area. My main area is regional climate modeling. This is what I've done for my PhD work. So essentially, regional climate modeling is just high resolution over a smaller area, but you still need boundary conditions from a global climate model. And then what I'm doing now is I take these climate projections and I put them on top of a hydrological model to study climate change impacts on water resources. So that's basically what I do today. And there are many areas where machine learning can be useful, but it's currently not used very widely. So the way I'm going to talk about this in this talk is I'll introduce the environmental prediction problem, or it's not always prediction, but most of the time. And I'll first talk about the empirical and physical models that are currently used, so to give you an idea of what's already being done and what the shortcomings of these methods are. And then I'll go into some examples of how machine learning was applied in this area. And towards the end of the talk, I'll also talk a bit about where I see this going and where I see opportunities and or challenges for machine learning in this context. And so first, I think I want to set the stage by highlighting the difference between data-driven models and physics-based models. So my background is in physics. I've done a lot of high-performance computing. There's a lot of CFD simulations, so computational fluid dynamics. There are other types of simulations like many-body simulations, Lagrangian simulations, which are based on physical principles. And they use numerical methods. Essentially, they're based on PDEs. These models are essentially PDE solvers or ODE solvers in some cases, right? This is the one extreme where I sort of grew up in. Then there's the other extreme, which is completely data-driven models. Historically, that has been statistical models. But today, when you say data-driven, most people think of machine learning, right? But there have been methods around for a long time, and I'll talk about some of these, that are essentially data-driven methods, but they're not what we would today classically call machine learning, right? And then there are also a lot of models that are sort of a hybrid between that. They're sitting in between. And so this is what I've marked as physical models here. They are fundamentally based on a model that solves PDEs, like a CFD model, but then there are a lot of empirical corrections to these models to represent processes that we are not really understanding well, or like vegetation processes, or that are just at the moment computationally not possible to resolve in a CFD model, like small-scale turbulence. So there's essentially the spectrum of modeling, right? So one of these things is streamflow prediction, and that I want to talk a bit about it, partly because that's what we also do in our company. And so here's the Humber River, and that's sort of like the scale of river that we would be trying to predict. And the graph above shows the flow over a period of 2 weeks, right? With actually a prediction at the end as well. And so this is what we're trying to do. We have recording of streamflow, and then we're trying to predict how the streamflow may evolve, right? And to do this, we first have to understand what actually drives streamflow. And now, so this is just a little bit about the environmental background here. What drives streamflow is really weather, right? Precipitation mainly, but not only precipitation. So there are complicating effects. One is snow. Snow just stores water on the ground and releases it later when it melts, right? But then there's, of course, also the whole biosphere, and plant evaporation is extremely important. So about 70% of the water that falls on the ground actually evaporates through plants most of the time. So this is a large factor that needs to be included, but it's not well understood. And yeah, snowmelt is the other thing that really needs to be considered. But then there's also delays through groundwater. So water infiltrates, but then exfiltrates later. That forms base flow. This is a very important process that's hard to model, right? So all these things need to be considered in some way. And so conceptually, you can sort of imagine this as like you have a hydrological model that encapsulates all the physics you're talking about here. This hydrological model is driven by a weather forecast. So this is actually true for a lot of environmental models. A lot of things depend on the weather. And so if you're trying to do any prediction, you actually need a weather forecast as a boundary condition. Then you also need initial conditions, so the conditions currently in the watershed. And then you can run this model as a prediction model, right? So conceptually, right? And this has been done for a long time with so-called conceptual or lumped statistical models. These are essentially data-driven models, but their structure is built based on physical insight. And this was, these models have been used since the 60s, way before machine learning was popular, right? They have buckets and decay factors and time delay factors, and they have a structure that makes physical sense, but all of these parameters, that like the decay parameters, for example, for groundwater, or the melting point for snow, these kind of things have to be calibrated for each basin. This is why they're data-driven. So they are calibrated and tuned or trained in a very similar way as a machine learning algorithm to reproduce the streamflow in a particular basin. And then in the parameters, you're basically encapsulating all the particularities of that watershed, right? So these models have been popular for a long time. They're very cheap to run. They're actually very effective. More recently, so the problem with these models is if you don't have stream gauge data, you basically can't use them. And this is the same with machine learning algorithms, right? If you don't have training data, it doesn't work. So now a lot of people are trying to build physical models, and this is also what we do in our company, especially for ungauged basins. This is actually quite hard, and in the US, there's a national water model, which is a sort of semi-empirical model where they're trying to really model the stream flow all over the US. I won't go too much into detail on this, though, but now I'm getting to the ML methods that can be used. So the data-driven models have a predefined structure that I've mentioned. The conceptual lump models have a predefined structure that I mentioned before, but they have to be tuned. And this is something that, in principle, is amenable to machine learning. Right? And people have been trying to do this for about 20 years now, ever since it became sort of known that you could do things with machine learning. And this has, until very recently, 2018, not been very successful. And the reason is that a general machine learning technique doesn't know the physics. And so the structure that is predefined in a conceptual model actually helps the model to predict because it doesn't have to learn the physics from scratch. You just have to tune some of the parameters that you don't know. Whereas like a neural network, for example, would have to learn the entire physical structure of this. And to do that, you need a lot of data. So previously, people have just been training a neural network on a single basin. And in a single basin, even if you have many years of Streamflow records, you actually don't have enough data for the model to learn the physics. And the big breakthrough on this was, well, part of it was to use LSTMs. LSTMs are obviously very useful because there's so many time-delayed effects. So accumulation of groundwater, snow, these kind of things, right? So you can represent that in an LSTM. So the structure already works much better. But the really big breakthrough came when people started to train the LSTM model on a very large set of different basins, basically all basins of the US. They used 3 decades of data from all basins of the US and trained the LSTM on that. And then it actually achieved really good performance that was better than the conceptual models because that allowed the model to learn a structure that basically represented the physics. So this is one major advance in machine learning in environmental prediction that I was cut at 2018. And so to the next topic now. One thing I want to mention, numerical weather prediction. In terms of environmental prediction, numerical weather prediction is probably the oldest, but it's mostly physics-based. And there is a huge network, and I just want to mention this because it's actually quite astonishing. This is a huge global enterprise. Basically, all nations cooperate on this, which is also quite amazing. And measurements are taken and coordinated almost everywhere on the globe, and they use satellites, weather balloons, weather stations, and all of this is ingested into giant computer models that run on supercomputers and produce predictions. And the economic value of this is actually quite large. But this is, at the moment, it's virtually all physics-based with some statistics in it. Another large component of this is data assimilation. So this is the estimation of the current state of the atmosphere, because weather prediction is essentially an initial condition problem. Right? So this is a massive effort, but there are many opportunities for machine learning. I'll get into some of those. So climate models and weather models are actually very similar. And Peetak already talked about this in his introductory talk for machine learning in climate science. So I'll just go over this very briefly. Essentially, they're CFD models. So they solve everything on a numerical grid. And then they have grid cells where in these grid cells, there are small-scale processes that have to be represented. And these are convection, vegetation, land surface processes, sea ice. And these processes are actually mostly represented by empirical or statistical methods, which are in principle amenable to machine learning. And there have been some really interesting efforts to do this. So convection is, for example, one of the things. So it's one of these subgrid scale processes. But convection has been a challenge for a long time because it is very complicated. So you can see the thunderstorm cloud here on the right-hand side. This is much smaller than a grid point in a climate model. It's about the size of a grid point in a weather model, right? But the physics of this is incredibly complicated because there's freezing and droplets are falling and there are updrafts and downdrafts and lots of turbulence and radiation and everything, right? And on top of this, this whole process tends to organize convection along the equator, where it is an absolutely dominant force in the global circulation. Without convection in the tropics, our circulation would look very different. Now, this is a perfect problem for machine learning, but it's actually really hard. And there have been a few people who worked on this. Noah Branowitz, who gave a talk here 6 weeks ago, I think, talked about this. He had a very good approach to this. It's quite difficult actually. There's another major paper, Sebastian Rasp, in 2018, that also looked at this, taking a different approach. But both of these approaches essentially use synthetic data. The problem here is that there's not enough observational data about convection available to actually train any kind of machine learning model. In this context, there are also other things that you can do with severe weather, and this is on the right-hand side, hail prediction. So weather prediction models are pretty bad at predicting hail, but they can actually predict precipitation and convection reasonably well because they are almost resolving it today. So you can apply machine learning algorithms then on top of that to predict whether a thunderstorm cell is going to produce hail or not. This is pretty interesting. You can also use machine learning to track thunderstorms, to identify different types of storms. There's a lot of interesting work in this regard as well. The butterfly effect is something I do need to mention. I won't go into any detail, but essentially the atmosphere is chaotic. So if you have just a slight change in your parameters or your initial conditions, you can get very different results. The problem is that this makes A/B testing very difficult, right? Because you're making a change, you get a different result, but unless you're doing a very long simulation or do lots of ensemble members, you don't know if this is just because of chaos or if this is actually a meaningful change. This is the main problem with this. The climate system also has a lot of internal variability because of this chaotic effect. Some of this internal variability happens at longer timescales. So there are many, many different timescales in the climate system, and especially the ocean acts quite slowly. You may have heard of El Nino, for example. The pattern that's shown on the right-hand side up there, this is the pattern of El Nino in global sea surface temperature. And in interannual variability, this explains 27% of the variance globally. This is quite astonishing. This is a very, very dominant effect in the climate system. And if you can just understand that effect, you already have a lot of predictability. But it essentially also means that there is like a smaller, lower dimensional manifold that the whole system is controlled by, right? And you can identify these manifolds using PCA analysis historically, but that's linear. So this is kind of difficult and it's very limited. So there are machine learning approaches to use variational autoencoders, for example, to get at these submanifolds in the climate system or these slowly varying variables. So there's a lot of interesting work in that regard. There's also causality inference. I won't talk about that, but it's very interesting for science. There are also ways to summarize ensembles and to weigh forecasts. This has been done with the large ensemble of climate projections that's available through the IPCC, for example. That's the graph on the right-hand side. So there's a lot of interesting work in that regard. Now, a very large area that I'll briefly talk about, and I'll just get to the end because I guess I'm already a bit over time, is remote sensing. So remote sensing is Earth observation from space primarily, actually also technically from drones or balloons or other things like that. But satellites are the most prominent and they collect the most data. They actually collect vast amounts of data. The problem is that these data are often not very useful by themselves and they're hard to interpret. So the reason why they're hard to interpret is that satellites essentially only measure radiances. So just brightness in different spectral bands. And then we need to relate these brightnesses to physical quantities we actually want to measure. And this is called the retrieval problem. So satellites don't measure soil moisture directly. There are soil moisture products from microwave satellites that purport to or claim to measure soil moisture, but actually they're just measuring microwave radiation, right? So you have to convert that into a signal in soil moisture or in snow or something like that, or NDVI, vegetation indices. The problem is that we understand the basic physics of why this would work, but there's so many complicating factors like clouds and vegetation that we don't really understand well enough, that these retrieval methods are essentially, at the end of the day, empirical. And we can model, we can do forward modeling of that. We can measure, we can model how a particular snow surface would emit microwaves. But inverting that from the received microwaves to the snow surface and all its layering and the soil moisture underneath is very difficult. So this is actually a very good example where machine learning could help, where you could do the forward modeling, or you can do in situ observations and compare to the satellite observations. And then you have a training pair where you can actually train an algorithm to do the inversion for you. So remote sensing has a lot of applications for machine learning. Historically, a major application that was already done in the 90s and in 2000s was land surface classification. So there are data sets that have land classes based on MODIS, for example, MODIS satellite images. And this was essentially done by clustering. So they just clustered based on different spectral bands, and then they looked at what these clusters were, and so basically looked up, okay, what is this pixel, what is this pixel, and this is in this cluster, and then basically identified, okay, this cluster tends to be forest, and this cluster tends to be urban. And so it's sort of a mixture of clustering and human intervention. And yeah, so then there are much more complicated methods now that look at tracking soil moisture from microwave satellites. I won't get too much into detail on this, but this is a very interesting topic as well. And data integration between like hydrological LSTMs, for example, that integrate microwave satellites. And there's a lot of stuff on that. One area that I've worked on with a student recently, and I just want to briefly highlight this here, is bias correction of snow. So there are data assimilation systems. Data assimilation systems, I mentioned this before, essentially use a physical model and then use observations from satellites or in situ to nudge the physical model towards an observed reality. And this way, even if you have sparse observations, you can sort of track a state and sort of fill in missing data, right? And the Kalman filter, you may have heard of this, is one of those data assimilation techniques. So this is also called control theory in electrical engineering. And it's used for radar, for example. And this is, so what the graph here is snow water equivalent. This is a data assimilation system for snow. And believe it or not, we actually don't have a very good idea of how much snow is on the ground, especially in northern Canada. This is quite astonishing. And so this data assimilation product over Canada is actually not performing very well. And there is an independent data set that we've got our hands on from the province where the conservation authorities actually do manual snow surveys with these augers that are shown on the right-hand side. So there are people going out and actually drilling into the snow and weighing the snow. And then we've compared the snow data assimilation system to that. And we found that there are huge differences in biases. And long story short, we've just decided to use our data set to bias correct snow dust. Because so the snow dust data assimilation system actually gets the patterns really well for the most part, especially the seasonal cycle and the melt points. It just gets the amount wrong. So you can bias correct this. And we just used a random forest. We trained it to take snow dust as input and then predict what the actual value at the snow survey sites would be. And we were able to reduce the bias significantly, much more than with like a linear bias correction, for example. Right. So, and this was just possible because we had this novel data set that hadn't been used before for this purpose, which was from the province. So this is just an example, right? So in summary, I would say there are areas. So there are basically three areas in environmental prediction. There's operational prediction, then there's physical modeling like climate modeling, and then there's remote sensing. And there are applications where there's very few data. This is, for example, water quality. It's very difficult. It would be convective parameterization if you're not using synthetic data. And then there are areas where there's lots of data. For example, radar data. There's tons of radar data. So there are actually ways to do nowcasting, like immediate forecasting of storms based on radar data. So that's basically a frame prediction, right? and climate models produce a ton of data, and summarizing these data with variational autoencoders, for example, is something where you have tons of data where machine learning can really help. In remote sensing, feature tracking storms, tracking hurricanes, for example. Well, hurricanes are actually fairly easy to track, but tracking convective storms, for example, from satellite images, this kind of stuff. There's lots of data, and you can summarize it using machine learning. And then there are sort of applications that are in between, like Streamflow prediction. We talked about this a bit. It was just difficult to put all the data together. Then there's inverse modeling, and talked a bit about that. It varies a bit how much data you have there and whether you want to use synthetic data. Synthetic data being data that's produced by a physical model. And then for climate modeling, there's bias correction and downscaling. Super resolution is sort of similar. There are some parameterization problems where there's more data available. Land surface fluxes, we now actually have a bit more data. So evaporation from vegetation is one of these things that is quite amenable to machine learning, in my opinion, but hasn't been done yet, because we've only recently got larger data sets on that. So this is sort of looking at the same thing, just from sort of a different angle and slicing it a little bit differently. So where do I see the main challenges or opportunities? With in situ observations, usually there's not enough data available to really do sophisticated machine learning. Really, what we need to figure out here is how to use all the low quality data, or how to find new data sets where we can use machine learning. This is the challenge there. With remote sensing, it's mostly object tracking and inverse modeling. I've mentioned this. In Earth system modeling, there is hybrid modeling. This is, I think, a large area that really holds a lot of promise. I don't think we really want to replace the CFD models, because we actually have high confidence in these models. They work really well. They just have some aspects like turbulence where we need to parameterize. And this is where machine learning can come in, and this is actually what Peetak does for his PhD. And this is a very important area. But then there's also things that are a bit more complicated, like vegetation or convection, for example, where people are working on. So replacing these particular parts, but keeping the main part of the climate model where we have confidence in, this is, I think, a very good way forward. Then there's also downscaling and bias correction. This is still a large area where bias correction is essentially a machine learning problem. This is what we did with the snow, right? Climate models need a lot of that. They still get things systematically wrong, and in a very systematic way that can be predicted, right? And summarizing data. So I think this is data analysis, and would be summarizing data in lower order manifolds, causal inference, and things like that, right? So hybrid modeling and data analysis, these are two big areas that are a bit separate from each other in Earth system modeling, right? So in conclusion, I would say we don't have a lot of observational data. And actually, humans are really good at identifying patterns. So in most observational data sets, humans have already identified most of the patterns, I think. But automated data mining is really good for model output, because we just have so much model output. Physical understanding is still very useful, I think, especially when there's not a lot of data. Because as you've seen in the case of hydrological modeling, physical understanding can really help augment sparse data or low volumes of data. Right? So in situations where you don't have a lot of data, physical modeling is still the way to go, I think, for the most part. But in situations, of course, where you do have a lot of data, you can use machine learning, especially in modeling. You can replace submodules in models with machine learning algorithms where our level of physical understanding is low. Yeah, so that's sort of my brief overview of different problems and opportunities in environmental prediction and modeling. I've lifted a lot of graphics from Wikipedia and Google Image just to have something to show. Okay, so now I think we can open the floor for questions and see if this is roughly clear. Yeah, we will stay here.
Thank you so much, Andre. This was pretty interesting and I believe an excellent overview of the entire spectrum of applicability of ML in this area. So we have some questions from our audience, and I'll just go over them one by one. So Amir is asking, what is another example? Like you talked about one example of bias correction, but with the snow data. So he was asking, do you have any other examples of bias correction other than fixing mixing data?
Other than
Fixing missing data.
Oh, I see. No, there are many applications for bias correction. So climate models, for example, tend to have systematic biases. So precipitation is a big one. And this actually is very closely linked to the fact that our current representations of convective precipitation is really poor, right? So because of that, so we use very simple empirical methods to represent convection in climate models. These tend to produce significant systematic biases. So they may have a very simple trigger function that is just based on environmental lifting or something. But there are other processes that cause convection on a smaller scale, like surface heating. And so this causes very systematic errors in the initiation and the representation of convection in the climate model. And this is something that can, in principle, be picked up by a machine learning algorithm and corrected. This is currently already done, but with purely statistical models.
Sure. No, yeah.
And so in weather prediction, it's called model output statistics.
Sure. Yeah. So to kind of stay on the same theme, Amir has a follow-up question. He's asking that when you talk about the snow data, the challenges with the missing data, is the challenge in the is in determining the depth of snow or the area of the snow coverage in northern Canada?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I guess that relates more generally to the data assimilation process. So what really the problem is the snow water equivalent. So how much water is stored in the snow. And this is what we really need to know. Like, nobody really cares how high the snow is, unless you, I don't know, on the road you care. But in most cases, what you really care about is how much water is stored, because that water is going to drain into a river and it's causing a flood. This is the one that's really difficult to measure. We have very good data for snow cover because it's very easy to spot from optical satellites, right? We have reasonably good data on snow depths, partly from manual measurement, because people can just stick a ruler in, right? Also from automated stations or from LiDAR. So planes, and they actually fly planes out in the Arctic that use lasers to measure the depths of snow. The problem is that still doesn't give us the water equivalent, because snow density can vary from 0.1 to 0.5. So this is where physical modeling comes in. So this is, at the moment, this is primarily done with physical modeling, with physical snow models. But there are many processes that are extremely complicated, like for snow aging causes the albedo, for example, to become lower. And that affects the melt significantly. And we didn't really understand how this works, and machine learning can probably help a lot there, because you could actually generate training data from optical satellites. Yeah, so there's, at the moment, it's done with mostly physical modeling, some statistical models that just relate. So what they did before is just average snow density, basically, on statistics based on season and location. And then you have your snow depth measurements, and then you're just estimating the snow water equivalent. But snow is a very complicated process. It also tends to layer a lot. There's internal melt. All of this is something that can probably be done with machine learning much better.
Interesting. Yeah, thanks for sharing your thoughts. So another question is about your about the convection slide. In the first part of your talk, you talked about the convection problem and how ML could help parameterize some of these subgrid models that are used currently. So you mentioned they're using synthetic data sets. So one of our audience members wants to know how are these data sets generated, and how good they are. Because if you're using them in the ML model, what is the efficacy of that data set?
Right. So this is a very good question. So yeah, this is the slide that we want to talk about. Okay. So what Noah did was he actually just used a very high resolution version of the same model. that resolves convection.
Yeah.
And so there's a big problem with this, which is this, right? So you cannot just run the high resolution model for a couple of years and then run the low resolution model and then just train the machine learning algorithm to produce a mapping between the two, because they completely decouple after a few days. So they just produce totally different weather. This is why this is difficult. So what Noah did is he ran the high resolution model, and then he initialized a coarse grain version of the model without convection from different checkpoints, and just ran it for a few hours to obtain basically what a coarse grain model would do from that state without representing convection. And then he has the high resolution state, and then he can map it to the coarse resolution state. That's only about 3 hours away. And so the decoupling, because of the chaotic nature of the atmosphere, is not significant yet.
Interesting.
So this is, this of course still depends on the fact that, or the assumption that the high resolution model represents convection properly.
Sure.
This is a big assumption because he was only running something like a few kilometer resolution, I think 3 kilometer, 1 kilometer, something like that.
But I think 1 kilometer, I think it was about 1 kilometer.
Yeah. This is usually what people do. So convection resolve, what's called convection resolving today varies between 1 and 4 kilometers. Now, technically, to really resolve convection, you would have to run an LES model at something like 100-meter resolution. So this is actually pretty far away still. And then there is another big factor, which is microphysics. So condensation processes in the cloud. And this is actually not that trivial. It's not just that you get condensation as soon as you hit the dew point and freezing when you hit 0 degrees. There's actually a significant delay in that process, and especially freezing. So the ice phase representation in your microphysics scheme is really important and not so well understood. So it can take up to 15 minutes for a super cool particle to actually freeze. This is the time that it takes to move through the entire cloud, basically. And this is also the reason that it's so difficult to predict hail. So the quality of these data sets is so-so, I'd say, of these synthetic data sets. We can do much better. We already know how to do much better, right? But that is computationally very expensive.
Sure.
A totally different approach that Sebastian Rasp used is, and this is again addressing this decoupling problem. He actually ran inside a GCM a small cloud resolving model that runs at each grid point, at each time step. And then he just trained an algorithm to predict from the large-scale state from the GCM what the small cloud resolving model does. Now, in order to make this computationally feasible, he ran this cloud resolving model just in a 2D mode. So not 3-dimensional, but just 2-dimensional. That captures most of the dynamics, but again, it's not perfect.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I thought. Like, turbulence is inherently 3D. So
right, it captures a lot of it, but it's not perfect, right? And in this graph on the lower left, you can sort of see. So the SPCAM, that's the super resolution super parameterization, where he has this little 2D model running at every grid cell, and this is it shows latitude and height. Pressure is altitude, basically, inverse pressure. And what you see, this red thing in the middle, this is the tropics, where you have the strong convection that's controlling the general circulation, right? And the representation of that in the SPCAM, so the super parameterized model, is pretty good. This is very close to observations. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. The neural network, this is NNCAM, actually predicts most of this quite well. So this is the middle figure. You can see this.
Sure.
And then the right hand is this is the control. This is what we're currently doing with our very simple empirical formulations. So they're actually horrible, as you can see.
Sure. Interesting.
So there are a lot of subtleties to this, and microphysics is one of the problems that we can do this in a lab though, but this is expensive. So we can generate clouds in a lab, and we can measure in wind tunnels the freezing process. And there are groups that work on this, but this is quite expensive and it's a very lengthy process to do. In principle, you could use machine learning to produce microphysics for this. This would be very interesting too. I don't think anybody has done this yet. Then you could plug this into an LES model, run at 100-meter resolution, simulate the clouds, and then train a deep neural network to predict the LES model. And ideally, you would run that inside a global climate model so that you don't have the decoupling process. So that you can see that this is a rather complicated process to get to a really good result with this.
Interesting, absolutely. So we'll take one last question from the audience, and this kind of goes back to your the snow snow problem you talked about in the end. And the question is that to fix the bias, you are using the same data to train the machine learning. So how do you measure the reliability of the so-called fixed bias? And how do you improve if you and how much do you think you can improve if your data is already sparse in nature? How does that affect your ability to improve the model predictions?
Right. So we didn't really improve the model itself. We just did an external bias correction on it, right? So of course we did cross-validation. So we withheld some of the snow survey sites and then looked at the bias that we see at the withheld locations. So the bias correction that you see here is the cross-validation error.
Sure.
So that is one thing we can do. But it is, of course, true. We are essentially using the snow survey sites to both validate it and to correct it. So we've actually done an independent verification on it. I don't have a slide on this, but we looked at the snow water equivalent that resulted from our bias-corrected SWE data set, so snow water equivalent data set, and compared it to Streamflow, just to look at over the catchment area, right? Just to see if what we are getting is reasonable. And so if you do this with SNODAS, and this is actually how we initially noticed that SNODAS has this large bias, if you integrate this water equivalent over a catchment area and you compare it to a stream gauge, you see that the water equivalent that you're getting is much higher than the stream flow.
Oh, wow.
Which is, of course, unphysical. This cannot happen.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
During the snowmelt period, right? This is how we noticed that there must be something wrong. And then we started looking into the snow survey data set. So we contact people in the province and in the conservation authorities. And then, so after we did the bias correction, we did this exercise again. And then we found that the values actually look very reasonable. So from the independent verification, so we're pretty sure that we are at least doing something reasonable.
That's very fascinating. Yeah, thank you so much, Andre. I think this was a very fascinating chat. And to all the audience members, thank you once again for joining in. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to me, Amir, or Andre. If you have an email or something, Andre, that you can quickly share with the audience.
It's not on the top.
You don't hear? Okay, yeah, but I'm sure they'll be hearing more from you in the future. Thank you so much once again, everybody, for joining in, and take care and stay safe.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peetak, for moderating this.
Thank you.